Ladies and gentlemen, it is safe to say that I have been slacking on my Twitter game. And that's because Wuthering Waves, 4 days ago actually, on January 16th, admittedly at 11 p.m., maybe that's why I didn't see it my time, they actually released news on the official stats and effect for Roccia's gauntlet, her special signature weapon, Tragicomedy. And so what I wanted to do today was take some time to, really figure out who some of its best users are going to be, obviously, aside from Roccia, whether or not it's worth it from an account perspective, if you're going to pull on it to equip on multiple characters, and kind of break down all of the nuances with its special effect, whether or not it's actually worth the astrite for you, and if, it's something that's better reserved as a skip, or if it's a must-have. And the answer will depend, obviously, depending on the state of your account, your roster, who you have, and who you enjoy playing. But hopefully, after this review, you'll have a much firmer understanding of, where to allocate your pulls. So with that, let's go ahead and dive right on into it. Starting off with, the very first image we're going to be seeing over here, Tragicomedy. The joys and sorrows of life dance in an endless circle. Pain and tears shift in an instant into a carnival. You wouldn't be wrong to think that this was initially a rectifier. I was actually surprised myself when Roccia was a gauntlet user. And you'll quickly find, and you were actually able to see this in game, Kuro is the one that actually uses these gauntlets. Roccia herself doesn't actually equip any weapons. And so that is sort of like the perspective here. Kuro punches people, does that quite often actually in the trailer. And so that's a bit of a reason for why they're a gauntlet user and not a rectifier, as it would be really easy for you to believe. So with that, let's go ahead and move on into the base stats for the weapon. And this weapon, at rank 1, though rank doesn't really matter for the base stats, it's gonna have the best in class and pretty traditional 587 base attack, really comparable to pretty much every other 5-star weapon in the game aside from Carlotta's signature, as well as those of Jeja and Yinlin, and accompanying that, a critical rate main stat of 24.3%. This is going to make Roccia a lot easier to build right off of the bat, because Roccia needs a 70 critical rate minimum in her stat allocation to get the full benefit of her ultimates buff, her liberations buff that grants 200 flat attack to the entire team upon casting the ability. She basically scales where you need like a certain amount over 50% will get you there, and 70% really is the gold standard. And so you're gonna want to combine this with a crit damage forecast, and through your substats, right, and through your investment in her skill tree, get that ratio up to a comfortable spot where your minimum, maybe a little bit lower depending on Shorekeeper, depending on if Shorekeeper's in your team, where that minimum, right, in combat is going to be at 70% to maximize that buff. Otherwise, you're losing value. And so this, admittedly, is a bit easier to build around compared to a critical damage main stat, because when you look at forecast echoes, and I'll just go ahead and I'll just pull up a random one from my roster. When you take a look at a critical rate forecast, it's only at 22% at the very max level of 25. And so when you have a critical damage weapon, you want to use a critical rate forecast. And when you have a critical rate weapon, you want to use a critical damage forecast. And so right off the bat, we're seeing a difference of about 2.3%. That's less than a substat, but it can make the difference, right? Especially as you're investing more and more, and then you're filling out all of those, echo slots, and you're just trying to get, the best ratio possible. And critical rate obviously is necessary to deal critical damage in the first place, so keep that in mind. This is going to be a little bit easier to build around, once again, than a critical damage weapon. So moving on, we've taken a look at the base stats. We've described kind of like what the benefits are. Let's go ahead now and dive into the actual effect. And this is where stuff gets a little bit dicey. So, Roccia's Tragicomedy, her signature, its weapon skill is going to be called Fool's Warble. And you can see all the different stats at different ranks. We'll be going over rank 1. It increases attack by 12%, which, in my opinion, is not as good as a general attribute damage bonus. Most of the time for a character, having an attribute damage bonus is a little bit more beneficial than attack. In like a baseline circumstance, that will increase your damage more. So in my opinion, having an attack increase instead of a general attribute damage buff, and again, I'll just use Jiyan's weapon as an example, a general attribute damage buff like this of 12% is typically a little bit worse, in my opinion, because an attribute damage buff is a lot harder to find. You only see it in character kits themselves or on the 3 cost. And damage bonus is typically allocated across, a specific damage type, when you roll it in your substats, while you can just roll attack on your echoes themselves. So that's another bit of a ding, in my opinion, when it comes to the general usability of a weapon, especially on other characters in Roccia. Next up, let's get into the actual damage boosting effect itself. Every time basic attack or intro skill is cast, heavy attack damage bonus increases by 48% for 3 seconds. And so what this means is that to fully benefit from this weapon, you need a character that constantly uses their basic attacks and then also constantly uses their heavy attacks. First, basic attacks to actually enable the bonus, and then heavy attacks to actually, gain a benefit from it. And so what you're gonna notice across the gauntlet users on the roster is that this is a little bit of a hard effect to activate. And the reason for that is obviously it's going to be easy for Roccia because she alternates between basic and heavy attacks across her entire rotation, so it'll have basically permanent uptime. But when we look at some of the other gauntlet users, and I'll go ahead and make this full screen to make it a bit easier for y'all to see. When you look at some of the other gauntlet users, starting off with Jiyan, this guy uses basic attacks, but doesn't really use them every 3 seconds. And the other thing is, bro does not ever use a heavy attack. He actually loses access to his heavy attacks during his Resonance Liberation. Basically, the intuition mode where he, does the big cube explosion and then starts dealing damage through the hypercubes. He actually can't cast a single heavy attack during that. And in his optimal skill builds, you don't even use his heavy attacks either because they don't really deal that much damage at all. This weapon on him is primarily just a stat stick. It's literally a stat stick where you get 12% attack and good base stats, but basically nothing else. I honestly do believe that the standard 5-star gauntlet might actually be better depending on your investment in your echoes. If I'm going to be honest, I would not pull Tragicomedy for Jiyan because he gains pretty much no benefit at all from its damage bonus. He uses no heavy attacks ever in his rotation other than to cancel them to trigger Void Thunder's set effect right over here, where you need to use a heavy attack, both one heavy attack and one resonant skill to cap it out. It's not that great. And heavy attacks, if you've seen his damage profile, ladies and gentlemen, are like 1 to maybe 2%, or in some rotations with lingering tunes, 0% of his damage. So I don't recommend it for him. If you're pulling it just for him, it's not a good idea. Next up on the roster, we're going to have, sorry, I don't have a lot of gauntlet users leveled, so they're going to be a bit closer to the bottom of the list. We're going to have Jianxin. And one thing you're going to notice about this character is that her forte circuit, right? The ability that some people never really use, but, is actually a pretty powerful part of her kit if you give her the field time to actually use it. This ability deals entirely heavy attack damage. The only thing is that, well, you got to make sure that you have really good timing to actually trigger this bonus because, and this is the kicker, guys, this is what some people aren't really seeing, this bonus lasts 3 seconds. And ladies and gentlemen, Jianxin's shield, I might be wrong, but I do believe it takes longer or exactly 3 seconds to actually trigger the whole forte explosion. 3 seconds is not a very long amount of time. And her forte circuit, I do believe it actually takes longer than 3 seconds to actually trigger. And if we're just looking at the scaling over here of the ability, that 412%, it happens at the end. That happens at the end. And so most of the damage in there is at the end where the Tragicomedy buff has already worn off. So even if you're pulling it for Jianxin, a little bit rough. In my opinion, in my personal opinion, I don't think you're going to have that much synergy. You're also going to have to prime it up with a basic attack before immediately going into her forte circuit to even activate the ability. And it's just, there's not that much synergy in here. And so for Jianxin, it's not looking too hot either. It might be good for her S6, but if you have Jianxin S6, you might as well just use her as a support at that point because she'll have instant access to her shield and pretty much instant access to her shielding. And so I'm not really sure who this weapon is designed for at this point. We've already gone through 2 of the wielders. Let's move on. So next up, this one's going to be Yohu. And ladies and gentlemen, let me just tell you that Yohu, her heavy attacks, obviously you see them at a low skill level. She kind of really doesn't use them that much either. She uses them to basically trigger her buffs across her kit. I might be wrong about this. Not a lot of people play her, but it's just the majority of her damage is through things like her resonance skill and her basic attacks. And so heavy attacks, again, are kind of just used to, again, trigger things across the rest of her kit. And so because of this, Yohu isn't really a amazing damage dealer either. Actually, let me go validate this real quick by taking a look at her damage profile. Yeah, let's check it out in game. Let's check it out in game real fast. Resonance skill damage. Yeah. So the fact that we don't see heavy attack damage on here leads me to believe that, yes, her heavy attack is used in her rotations to trigger some things, but it's not really a majority source of her damage. So with that, her Forte Circuit is where most of her damage is, and that doesn't deal heavy attack damage either. And so this is another character that really doesn't have synergy with Tragicomedy, unfortunately. Let's move on to the next one. The next one on the list is going to be Yanwu. Ladies and gentlemen, this guy doesn't really deal any damage type at all. Specifically, heavy attacks too, he doesn't really do that much either. He also scales with defense, and so a general attribute damage bonus is way better on him, which obviously this weapon doesn't have because it increases attack. This does almost nothing for his scaling. It does give him nice crit and nice base attack that he doesn't use. And he's mainly just a coordinated attacker that triggers Jinxi's Forte Circuit. He's not really a damage dealer in the first place, and so pulling this weapon for him or trying to find a use case for this weapon on him, I don't recommend it, frankly. I don't. You'll probably, the only damage that's going to be dealt from equipping Tragicomedy on him is mental damage to you for trying to make it work. That's pretty much all the mileage you're going to get out of him. All right, and now for the final user of this weapon, and this one is going to be Ling Yang. And let me just look up something real quick. According to Pridewin, and in some of Ling Yang's optimal rotations, heavy attacks are about 2.7% of his damage, with the majority of it being basic attacks and skill damage. So this website obviously could be wrong in their calculations, but they do have a rotation, right? They do have a rotation over here that makes a lot of sense and that I'm pretty sure has been validated. And we do already know from Abyss Surges, right? The actual 5-star gauntlet in the store, the one that's specifically geared towards him. We do know that from Abyss Surges, it buffs basic attack damage and resonance skill damage, which are Ling Yang's main damage sources. And so heavy attacks for him are also not really a big part of the pie, and you're gonna kind of have to force them to gain a benefit from this weapon buff. And so at this point, you're probably getting the full picture. This might be one of the most specific weapons in the game. This might be a weapon that you're only going to find a use case for on Roccia, or if you just want a general 12% attack buff and good critical stats. But if that's the case, why not just pull Zhang Liao's weapon? Why not just pull this weapon that gives you a better bonus of 12% attribute damage buff, has the same exact critical stats, and then buffs resonance liberation damage, which pretty much every character in the game, at least every gauntlet user, actually does. That's probably going to get you a little bit more mileage. And even looking at Roccia herself, it does seem like she's intentionally designed not to work with Zhang Liao's weapon, because her ultimate deals heavy attack damage. And so Zhang Liao's weapon overall is going to be just a stat stick on her. Her weapon is going to be kind of like the only thing that buffs her damage. And think about it this way, ladies and gentlemen. When her weapon is the only one that really works on her, and then her weapon doesn't really work on anybody else's, that's a little bit rough. That's a little bit painful. If you're pulling it as a 5-star weapon, knowing that you can share it across your account and content like the Tower of Diversity, it's a bit of a rough pull. It is a bit of a rough pull, I'm going to be honest. She's not going to work on Stone Art either. She's not going to work on the BP weapon either, because ladies and gentlemen, that one boosts your resonance liberation damage. So it does seem like she's intentionally designed to be almost as clunky as possible with the existing options, and that's a bit of a shame. That is a bit of a shame. And so you should only be pulling this weapon if you really want to buff Roccia's damage. But you also have to keep in mind that Roccia is a sub DPS, and she's inherently not going to be dealing all of the damage on the team in the first place. And so you're spending this amount of cash or this amount of pulls and resources on a small part of the team's damage relative to, say, pulling Camelia's weapon, right? Who's going to be Roccia's best in slot teammate. That's my take on the meta viability of this weapon. If it wasn't clear from everything that I've been saying, it's extremely low. It's a very low value pull. However, though, on the bright side when it comes to this character, you're going to have some pretty comfortable Ascension materials. Everybody should have these. You can pre-farm for these if you are, for some reason, pulling this weapon. You'll be able to just do it with the baseline Cadence Blossoms and Cadence Leaves. You can farm these. You've been able to farm them since 1.0. So glad to see we're not seeing any customized resources here for Renacida. And the Howler Cores are obviously something that we've been able to farm since the start of the game. And so a lot of day one players will have a lot of store of these. Upgrading this weapon shouldn't really be a problem in the first place. But yeah, that's the final take on this weapon. I think it is, I'm going to be honest, I think it's pretty fucking bad. It looks cool. It looks cute on Pero, but my gosh, it doesn't work on anybody else. It is, in my opinion, a really, really poor pull. It would have been nicer to see a more general weapon for her, knowing that she's already like a very specific character that has a great alternative, right? A great free alternative like Sanhua to buff the Camellia team. And so having like a more powerful weapon would have been a great way, in my opinion, to offset her. But this one is kind of doo-doo water. So with that, hopefully that was helpful. Hopefully that was as in-depth as possible regarding its use cases. I don't think it has very many. Let me know what you all think. Peace out.